Jeepers creepers! Fiddlesticks! I have no place to walk in my house! Jeepers creepers!
I mean, how could you take him seriously? You can't. You just can't. But for this video, I will. I've been someone who defended Stephanie Soo, and still do. But I believe that looking at the full picture matters. The connections and what this reveals about content culture. I didn't expect this to mess with me, but it did. So I've been following YouTube drama for years. You know how it goes. Someone says something, someone else responds. Everyone picks sides, and then we all move on to the next thing. But this situation between Nikocado Avocado and Stephanie Soo, this one kept bothering me. Not because it was particularly shocking or because I had strong feelings about either creator, but because something about the whole thing felt incomplete. Like there were layers underneath that nobody was really talking about. So when Nikocado brought it back up, I found myself going down this rabbit hole, and the more I dug into it, the more I realized this isn't really about YouTube drama. It's about two people and how they can experience the exact same situation and walk away with completely different realities. And how those realities say something pretty unsettling about the way we navigate relationships, boundaries, and truth in spaces where everything is consent. So here's what happened, and more importantly, here's what I think it reveals about the psychology behind it all.
But you have to understand where I'm coming from too. I'm clearly signaling to you, I am ready. You are here for to be ready. I'm not going to just grab it because you will come back and it's gonna be the little Me Too movement. Oh.
He's not here to be ready for you. Nobody is here to be ready for you. And it's not the little Me Too movement. How dare you discredit an entire movement that the sole purpose was giving people a voice who didn't have a voice. How dare you discredit the entire thing that saved so many people because you had a bad date in New York City.
But later, she told the internet that I knew these personal things about her.
And I was nervous. I definitely had a guard up. I ended up opening up about something that I don't even talk about on YouTube. I was in my own home. It was somebody that I had let into my home. I told him about the one thing that I don't talk to anyone.
That was strategic, so that she could paint me in the worst possible light and then turn people against me in the worst possible way. And you've probably heard the phrase, in and out of sleep. It's something that people say when they're tired. And that's exactly how Stephanie used it with me when she texted me, when she didn't show up to our collab last minute.
I was in and out of sleep. Hey guys, sorry I've been in and out of sleep.
I remember thinking, really? In and out of sleep? I mean, I cleared my whole schedule to be here. I flew to her state. I was really upset, and I ranted about it.
Just been in and out of sleep, and I don't know what's
like, in and out of sleep, in and out of sleep. But in her video, she reframed the phrase in and out of sleep in the context of use, but only after telling people that I knew she had been in the past, which I didn't.
You knew why. I'm so paranoid. You know why.
Was it wrong for me to vent about it with my friends? Yes. Was it wrong for me to vent about it online? Yes. But we weren't joking or laughing about her being I didn't know that. My friends didn't know that. None of us knew that. We were reacting to what felt like being ghosted before a major collaboration.
Let me paint the picture for you. Late 2019. Stephanie Soo is this mukbanger who's built her channel around this very specific aesthetic. soft-spoken, vulnerable, often sharing personal stories while eating. She's not loud or dramatic. Her whole thing is this quiet intimacy with her audience. She talks about trauma, her struggles, about feeling unsafe in the world. Her viewers see her as someone who's been through a lot and is trying to heal. Nikocado Avocado, on the other hand, well, if you know YouTube, you know Nikocado. By 2019, he was already deep into what would become his signature. Extreme eating, emotional outbursts, trauma with other YouTubers. His content thrived on chaos, on being unpredictable, on pushing boundaries. Everything was loud, everything was intense, everything was a lot. These two were supposed to collaborate, a simple mukbang, where they'd eat together, film some content, done. Standard YouTube stuff. But Stephanie canceled last minute, and that's where things get interesting. Because what happened next depends entirely on who you ask. And that's what's been eating at me about this whole thing. Two people, same events, completely different stories about what those events mean.
It seemed like because of those videos, and then we didn't publicly talk to each other, like post like pictures or videos until way after when we met like a couple months ago.
Like a year later.
Yeah, so during that time period, people thought that maybe we didn't like each other at all.
Okay.
Because of those videos. So,
okay.
I mean, I didn't feel that way though.
Okay.
Did you feel that way?
That you didn't like
I'm like,
me?
suddenly getting like, suddenly like real tears.
She's like, oh God. It wasn't until we met in person, 3 or 4 months ago that we sat down and you really opened up to me. And when you sat down with me, we literally, how long we were at that restaurant for? Till 2 a.m. They kicked us out of there.
Yeah, they did.
Pretty much. We were there for like 4 hours. And we talked about a lot of his personal life, my personal life, her goals, da-da-da. But as friends, she also...
Oh, I don't have a personal life. I'm just kidding.
Stephanie's version goes like this. During their planning conversations, Nikocado kept pressuring her to discuss another YouTuber, Veronica Wang, during their mukbang. Stephanie didn't want to. She felt uncomfortable turning someone else into content, especially in a negative way. But according to her, Nikocado wouldn't let it go. He kept pushing, kept guilt-tripping her, kept making her feel like she was being difficult. Then, she says, things escalated. He allegedly took photos inside her home without permission during a previous visit. He examined her ceiling, looking for cameras, she suspected. He threatened to release receipts and audio clips if she didn't do what he wanted. The whole thing made her feel manipulated, intimidated, unsafe. So she canceled the collaboration and then made a video explaining why. Now, Nikocado's version, especially the one a few hours ago, tells a completely different story. He admits he was immature and unprofessional. He acknowledges that his reaction to her canceling was over the top, but he also claims that Stephanie exaggerated the situation for views, that she invoked the Me Too movement unnecessarily, that the house photos were taken during a consensual tour where they were discussing interior design, that he had no idea about her trauma history when all this went down. Here's what fascinates me. I believe both of them are telling the truth as they experienced it. And that's what makes this so psychologically complex. You see, the more I looked into this, the more I started seeing patterns, not just in this specific situation, but in how these kinds of conflicts play out online. First, there's the vulnerability mismatch. Stephanie built her brand on being open about her trauma, her triggers, her need for safety. Her audience knows she's been through sexual assault. They know she struggles with feeling secure. When she talks about feeling intimidated or manipulated, her viewers understand that this hits different for someone with her history. But here's the thing. Nikocado says he didn't know about her trauma when this all went down. And you know what? I actually believe him. Because if you look at how he operates, he's not particularly attuned to other people's emotional states. His content style is all about his own feelings, his own drama, his own reactions. He's not someone who picks up on the subtle cues about what makes other people uncomfortable. So you have someone who's hypersensitive to power dynamics and manipulation tactics interacting with someone who's not. Someone who's learned to read every social interaction through the lens of potential threat, meeting someone who barrels through conversations focused on getting what he wants. That's a recipe for miscommunication, but it's also something more interesting than just miscommunication. One of the most disturbing aspects of Nikokado's response is his claim that he has audio recordings of their conversation. He mentions having receipts and suggests that Stephanie's behavior during their actual interaction was different from how she presented it in her video. Now, setting aside the legality and ethics of recording someone without their knowledge, this reveals something really unsettling about how some people navigate relationships in the digital age. The idea that every conversation might be recorded, that every interaction might be evidence in some future public trial. Think about how that changes the dynamic of human connection. If you know or suspect that someone might be recording you, how do you be vulnerable? How do you express uncertainty or work through feelings in real time? How do you have the messy, imperfect conversations that actual relationships require? Stephanie talked about feeling like she had to perform strength during their conversations because she sensed that vulnerability might be used against her later. And honestly, if someone's recording you without your knowledge, that instinct makes perfect sense. But here's where it gets even more complex. Both of these people make their living by turning their personal lives into content. Stephanie's whole brand is built on sharing her trauma and healing journey. Nikokado's is built on dramatic reactions and interpersonal conflict. So when a real interpersonal conflict happens between them, what is it? Is it a genuine human interaction that should be handled privately? Or is it content? Is it both? Stephanie made a video about the situation. That's turning a private conflict into public content. Nikocado responded with his own videos and social media posts. More content. Then Stephanie responded to his responses, even more content. At what point does the original human interaction get completely lost in the content cycle? At what point are we not talking about what actually happened, but about the narrative performance of what happened? This is what I find most unsettling about this whole thing. It's not just that two people had a conflict, it's that the conflict itself became a product. And once something becomes a product, truth gets complicated. One thing that really struck me while researching this was how differently trauma responses can look from the outside. Stephanie's trauma response is what most people expect. Clear boundaries, explicit communication about feeling unsafe, visible emotional distress. She cries in her videos. She talks about triggering situations. She asks for support from her audience. But there's another type of trauma response that's much less visible. The kind where you become hypervigilant about control and documentation, where you start recording conversations because you've learned that people will gaslight you about what actually happened, where you develop strategies to protect yourself that can look manipulative to people who haven't been through what you've been through. Now, I'm not saying this is what happened with Nikocado. I don't know his history well enough to make that claim, but I do think it's worth considering that people who've been hurt develop different survival strategies, and sometimes those strategies can hurt other people even when that's not the intention. This is probably the most controversial aspect of the whole situation. Stephanie referenced the Me Too movement when describing her experience. Nikocado, in his most recent response, called this an inappropriate invocation of a little Me Too movement. Here's where I think both of them miss something important. Stephanie wasn't claiming sexual assault. She was describing a pattern of behavior, pressure, intimidation, boundary violations that shares psychological DNA with sexual coercion. The same power dynamics, the same disregard for consent, the same assumption that persistence will eventually wear someone down. But Nikocado heard Me Too and thought she was accusing him of sexual misconduct, which, to be fair, is how a lot of people interpret any reference to that movement. So he got defensive and dismissive. What nobody really addressed in the Me Too was never just about sexual assault. It was about power, consent, and the ways that people in positions of influence use that influence to get what they want from people with less power. In the YouTube ecosystem, subscriber count is power. Platform is power. Being willing to create public drama is power. And if you look at it that way, what Stephanie described does fit into broader patterns of how power gets abused in digital spaces. After going through all the evidence, the original videos, the responses, the social media posts, the timeline of events, I think I understand what really happened here, and it's both simpler and more complex than either of their narratives suggests. Two people with completely different communication styles and trauma histories tried to collaborate. One person's way of advocating for herself looked like manipulation to the other person. One person's way of pursuing what he wanted looked like intimidation to the other person. Both people felt hurt and misunderstood. Both people told their stories publicly in ways that made sense to them but didn't fully account for the other person's experience. But here's the thing I couldn't shake. This isn't really about whether Nikocado is a manipulator or whether Stephanie exaggerated. This is about something much more fundamental. How do we navigate consent and boundaries in spaces where everything is content? So you see, traditional consent models don't really work in creator spaces. When your job is to share your life, when your income depends on being willing to discuss personal topics, when your brand is built on vulnerability, how do you say no to something without it affecting your livelihood? So Stephanie felt pressured to discuss Veronica Wang, but was that pressure coming from Nikocado specifically, or from the broader economic reality of YouTube? If you're known for being willing to share personal stories, and someone suggests a collaboration that involves sharing someone else's personal story, how much choice do you really have? Similarly, when Nikocado's collaboration fell through, his income was affected. His content calendar was disrupted. From his perspective, he had every right to be upset about the professional impact of her decision. But from Stephanie's perspective, her safety was more important than his content plans. And honestly, she was right about that. This is the fundamental tension in creator culture. The assumption that everything is negotiable, that every boundary can be pushed if the content is good enough, that personal comfort is less important than professional opportunity. The recording issue reveals something even more disturbing about digital relationships. When Nikocado mentions having audio recordings, he's essentially saying, I have evidence that will prove my version of events. But what does that actually prove? That someone sounded different in private than they did in public? That they were polite during a conversation they later described as uncomfortable? Anyone who's ever been in an uncomfortable social situation knows that you can sound fine in the moment and feel terrible about it later. You can be polite to someone's face and still feel manipulated by them. You can participate in a conversation while feeling pressured to do so. The existence of a recording doesn't invalidate someone's emotional experience of that conversation, but in our current culture, we often act like it does. We treat documentation as objective truth, when really it's just one perspective captured at one moment in time. Both Stephanie and Nikocado ended up performing their positions for their audiences. Stephanie performed hurt, vulnerability, the need for protection. Nikocado performed confusion, frustration, wrongful accusation. But here's what's interesting. Both of those performances can be true and still be performances. Stephanie really was hurt. She really did feel manipulated and unsafe. But she also knew that presenting her story in a particular way would generate support from her audience. And Nikocado, he was really confused about why his behavior was being interpreted as threatening. He really did feel like he was being unfairly categorized. But he also knew that presenting himself as the victim of false accusations would generate support from his audience. The performance doesn't invalidate the underlying emotions. Well, actually, there is a clip from the show Oshinoko where one of the main characters would not necessarily fake their emotions, but exaggerate them to fit this narrative. And I thought that was really cool because it was so captivating. But besides that, it does complicate our ability to understand what actually happened. You see, YouTube rewards certain types of content: emotional content, dramatic content, and we have seen this quite a lot frequently. Content that generates strong reactions and lots of comments. Both vulnerability and conflict are engagement drivers. So when a real human conflict happens between creators, there is enormous incentive to turn it into the kind of content that performs well. That means amplifying the most dramatic elements, focusing on the most emotionally resonant aspects, presenting clear heroes and villains rather than complex human beings making imperfect choices. Stephanie's video about the situation was good content. It was emotional, personal, detailed. It generated sympathy and support. It reinforced her brand as someone who's vulnerable and needs protection. Now, Nikocato's responses were good content too. They were dramatic, defensive, full of evidence and counter-narratives. They generated controversy and discussion. They reinforced his brand as someone who's misunderstood and unfairly targeted. But was any of it helping them actually resolve their conflict? Or was the conflict just fuel for the content machine? One of the most toxic aspects of this whole situation is how it played out in front of their respective audiences. Stephanie's viewers largely supported her interpretation of events. Nikocato's viewers largely supported his. But these audiences weren't neutral observers. They were consumers with emotional investments in their chosen creators. They wanted their favorite person to be right, to be the victim, to be vindicated. So instead of getting thoughtful analysis of complex interpersonal situation, we got a tribal warfare. Team Stephanie versus Team Nikokato, with both sides treating their preferred narrative as absolute truth and the other narrative as malicious lies. This is what happens when private conflicts become public content. The people involved lose control of their own story. Their audiences become participants in the conflict rather than observers of it, and resolution becomes almost impossible because admitting complexity or nuance feels like betraying your supporters. One pattern I noticed in discussions of this situation is the tendency to rank different types of emotional harm. Stephanie's trauma, sexual ongoing struggles with safety gets treated as real trauma that should be accommodated and protected. But what about Nikocato's emotional experience? What about the impact of being publicity characterized as manipulative and threatening? What about the effect on his mental health and career? I'm not suggesting these experiences are equivalent. Sexual is obviously more severe than YouTube drama, but I do think we sometimes create hierarchies of suffering that make it impossible to acknowledge when someone has been hurt in a lesser way. Nicocato probably did behave in ways that made Stephanie feel unsafe. That's real harm that deserves to be taken seriously. But Stephanie's public characterization of their interactions probably also caused real harm to Nicocato's reputation and self-image. Now, can both of these things be true? Can we hold space for multiple types of harm without minimizing any of them? When Nicocato brought this situation back up a few hours ago, at the time of this recording, something interesting had changed. He was no longer the same person he was in 2019. The dramatic weight loss, the shift in his content style, the reflection on his past behavior, all that gave him a different perspective on what had happened. In his latest video, he admits to being immature and unprofessional. He acknowledges that his reaction was over the top, but he also maintains that Stephanie's characterization of events was exaggerated and performative. And I checked the comments out and they were very one-sided. And you know what? I think he's probably right about both things. He probably was immature and unprofessional. And Stephanie probably did present her experience in a way that was strategically designed to generate maximum sympathy and support. But here's what I find most interesting about his perspective. He probably was immature and unprofessional, and Stephanie probably did present her experience in a way that was strategically designed to generate maximum sympathy and support. But here's what I find most interesting about his 2025 perspective. He talks about how this incident influenced him to move away from drama-based content. How it made him realize that turning interpersonal conflicts into entertainment was harmful to everyone involved. And I mean, that suggests a level of self-awareness and growth that wasn't present in his original responses. It also suggests that maybe both of them learned something from this experience, even if they learned different things. You see, this situation illuminates so many problems with how we approach relationships and conflict in digital spaces. The way economic pressures make genuine consent almost impossible. When your livelihood depends on being willing to share personal information, saying no becomes a luxury many creators can't afford. The way documentation gets weaponized in interpersonal conflicts, recording conversations, screenshotting private messages, saving receipts, all of this creates an adversarial dynamic that makes genuine vulnerability and repair impossible. The way audiences become participants in conflicts rather than observers. When millions of people have opinions about your personal relationships, those relationships stop being so personal. The way trauma gets commodified and ranked, Some types of emotional harm are seen as worthy of protection and accommodation, while others are dismissed or minimized. The way platform algorithms reward drama and emotion over nuance and complexity, the most thoughtful, balanced takes on the situation got the least engagement. What strikes me most about this whole thing is the human cost. Two people had a conflict that could have been resolved privately with honest conversation and mutual respect. Instead, it became a public spectacle that lasted years and probably caused ongoing harm to both of them. Stephanie had to relive a traumatic experience publicly, defend her interpretation of events, and deal with harassment from people who didn't believe her story. And Nikocado had to see himself characterized as manipulative and threatening, defend his reputation against accusations he felt were unfair, and cope with the ongoing impact on his career and self-image. Now, neither of them got what they actually needed: understanding, validation, resolution, and repair. This situation isn't unique. Variations of this same dynamic play out across social media platforms every day. Interpersonal conflicts become content. Private conversations become public evidence. Audiences choose sides and weaponize their support. And the platforms profit from all of it. The more dramatic the conflict, the more engagement it generates. The more engagement it generates, the more money everyone makes. Except for the actual human beings at the center of the drama, who often end up being more hurt than they started. We've created a system that incentivizes turning our worst moments into entertainment, and then we act surprised when people get hurt in the process. I think there are lessons here for anyone navigating relationships in digital spaces. Consent is complex when everything is content. Just because someone shares personal information online doesn't mean they've consented to having that information used in various ways they're not comfortable with. Documentation can be helpful, but it can also be weaponized. Recording conversations or saving screenshots might protect you legally, but it changes the entire dynamic of human connection. Audiences are not neutral observers. When you make your personal conflicts public, you're inviting millions of people to participate in your relationship dynamics. That will change those dynamics in ways you can't predict or control. Trauma responses are diverse and sometimes contradictory. Someone can feel genuinely harmed by an experience while also strategically presenting that experience in ways that serve their interests. Platform incentives shape human behavior in profound ways. If drama generates more engagement than resolution, people will gravitate toward drama even when resolution would be healthier for everyone involved. Both Stephanie and Nikocado seem to have grown from this experience in different ways. Stephanie continues to advocate for boundaries and safety in creator spaces. Nikocado has moved away from drama-based content and focused more on personal transformation. But the systems that created their conflict are still in place. platforms are still rewarding drama over resolution. Audiences still treat creator conflicts as entertainment. Economic pressures still make genuine consent difficult in creator collaborations. And until we address those systemic issues, we're going to keep seeing variations of the same story play out. Different creators, same dynamic, different details, same underlying problems. You see, I started this research thinking I was going to figure out who was right and who was wrong in this situation. But what I had discovered instead is that both people were probably right about their own experiences and wrong about the other person's motivations. Stephanie really did feel manipulated and unsafe. Her trauma history made her particularly sensitive to certain types of pressure and boundary violations. Her decision to cancel the collaboration was the right choice for her mental health and safety. Nikocado really was confused and frustrated with her characterization of their interactions. His communication style and personality made him less attuned to her emotional state than he should have been. His defensive response was understandable, even if it wasn't helpful. The tragedy is that with better communication, clearer boundaries, and less pressure to turn everything into content, this whole conflict might have been avoided, or at least resolved privately, without years of public drama and ongoing harm to both parties. That's what I find most sad about this situation. Not that it happened, but that the system we've created makes it almost inevitable that conflicts like this will keep happening. The question isn't whether Stephanie was right or Nikocado was right. The question is, how do we create spaces where people can be vulnerable, set boundaries, make mistakes, and repair relationships without turning all of that into entertainment for millions of strangers? Now, I don't have a good answer to that question yet, but I think it's the right question to be asking. And maybe that's the most important thing I've learned from diving deep into this situation. Sometimes the real story isn't about who's right or wrong. Sometimes it's about what our conflicts reveal about the system we're all trying to navigate, and how those systems shape us in ways we don't always recognize or understand. Now, that's a harder story to tell them. This person good, this person bad. But I think it's a more honest one, and in a world full of performance and positioning, honestly feels pretty rare. So that's what I'm left with. Not answers exactly, but better questions, and a deeper appreciation for how complicated it is to be human in spaces designed to turn our humanity into content. I hope both Stephanie and Nikocado continue to grow and heal from this experience, and I hope the rest of us can learn something from their story about how to do better in our own relationships, both online and off. Because at the end of the day, this is what it's really about. How do we treat each other with dignity and respect in spaces that incentivize us to do the opposite? How do we stay human in systems that are designed to turn us into content? Those are the questions that keep me up. And I think they're worth asking, Because even if, especially if, we don't have easy answers. Anyway, stay cozy, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next one.